The following is an Operation Podcast production.
Heart disease has been the number one killer and still is the number one killer. Most people think you have to have a 90% blockage to have a heart attack. Most heart attacks occur on 30 to 40% blockage.
Come on, no way.
Heart disease is not all just about cholesterol. I mean, heart disease is not driven strictly by cholesterol. It's what changes that cholesterol into an oxidized LDL or to a damaging cholesterol that causes heart disease. And that's the part we've been missing for a long time. Looking at the root cause of what's changing that cholesterol into that type of cholesterol that can get incorporated into the vessel. What ends up happening is, for example, when you cut yourself, what happens? You form a scab, right? What inside the body, if we have an artery that's damaged, right, and we form a scab inside of the coronary artery, what happens? It blocks off that artery and you have a heart attack. I would tell you that at least 50% of heart disease is driven by environmental toxins that we don't really do a great job of evaluating. Heavy metals, plastics, insecticides, and pesticides. See a lot of
Leading to cardiovascular disease?
Oh, absolutely.
Really? How would you define and describe nitric oxide? And do you agree that it is, in fact, the most important molecule in the human body?
I think we have known and we think about nitric oxide as just a vasodilator. That's kind of what we think about it. But there's so much more to nitric oxide. It controls platelet functions, it's antiplatelet functions. I mean, the monocytes or white blood cells don't stick to the vascular wall. And nitric oxide helps with that. Nitric oxide controls the mitochondrial function. And nobody really talks about that. So nitric oxide has a lot of good roles, okay? But what I want to talk to you about today is... Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Davis, and I am a triple board certified interventional cardiologist. I'm here to welcome you to Ever Forward Radio.
All right, I just want to jump right in.
Absolutely, let's go.
Dr. Davis, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Great to be here.
The Heart Health Masterclass, heart health, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, nitric oxide. I even understand you have a hot take, your own spin on the NO space, which I've covered a few times on the show with the greats like Dr. Ignaro, Dr. Brian. I'm excited to hear what you have to say in the world.
Absolutely.
So tune in, everybody. This is going to be just hard-hitting, heart-pumping, pun intended, just a lot of information here. Number one, is heart disease still the number one killer in America for people who even think they're healthy?
Yeah, absolutely. Heart disease has been the number one killer and still is the number one killer. And hopefully we'll get through some of these questions and we'll talk about why that is. Part of it is just sometimes we're looking and barking up the wrong tree.
What do you think about people still having heart attacks with, quote, normal cholesterol?
Well, that's exactly what I'm referring to, because the cholesterol is important in heart disease, but heart disease and having heart attacks is not just about cholesterol. And I think we've placed way too much emphasis on the cholesterol part itself. There are lots of different kinds of cholesterol, if you will, right? And understanding, the particle sizes and particle numbers and understanding what type of cholesterol you have is incredibly important. We've all learned about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, HDL and LDL, but not all LDL is bad cholesterol. Not all HDL is good cholesterol. Heart disease is an inflammatory, oxidative stress-driven process. The reason we still have heart attacks is because we could have minimal blockages in the artery and still have a heart attack because of vascular damage from inflammation driven by lots of things. We'll talk about that stuff too probably soon, but that's the reason we continue to have heart disease and heart attacks with normal cholesterol.
So do you feel like right now, if you could kind of rewrite the narrative on cholesterol, what would be your one-liner?
Yeah, the one-liner is heart disease is not all just about cholesterol. I mean, heart disease is not driven strictly by cholesterol. It's what changes that cholesterol into an oxidized LDL or to a damaging cholesterol that causes heart disease. And that's the part we've been missing for a long time. Looking at the root cause of what's changing that cholesterol into that type of cholesterol that can get incorporated into the vessel wall.
So it's not just about the cholesterol, it's about these other, life-threatening plaque buildup materials, or is that just cholesterol?
Well, it's the type of cholesterol. We've heard of oxidized LDL. Okay, LDL, we are taught that it's not bad cholesterol, but again, oxidized LDL is rusty cholesterol I like to talk about. Most people ask, what is oxidation? What is oxidative stress? Well, if you just think about a pipe of a 100-year-old house, that pipe has layer upon layer upon layer of rust inside. And that rust is what? Oxidative stress. Well, that's what's happening inside our body. We are getting oxidized. We're getting rusty inside, and those cholesterol particles are getting rusty. Lipid peroxides or oxidized LDL is what gets incorporated into the vessel. So it's damaged cholesterol. If the cholesterol is not damaged and we don't have oxidized LDL, then most of the time, that type of cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. In fact, we know that if we look at mortality data, As we start to get lower and lower cholesterols, say your cholesterol is 140, where your risk of dying from all-cause mortality, all causes is higher than if your cholesterol is at the 200 range.
Really?
Right? Absolutely. So we just Google all-cause mortality and cholesterol levels and look at what you get. Nobody talks about that, though.
No, this is kind of I'm like raising my eyebrows over here. I remember back in my clinical days, I used to be a clinical health coach, and I would always focus more on, I guess, reading a lot more about cholesterol is not, the demon we make it out to be. And I would focus more on my patient's ratio, the HDL to LDL ratio in total, versus like if they had a high LDL or even high total. Is that still the case? Is the ratio still a good determining factor?
That's kind of an old kind of approach to this as well. Nowadays, we're looking at different types of, we can look at particle sizes, right? We can look at the LDL particle number and particle size. And we know that the particle size, the small, dense particles are the particles that typically cause more heart disease, typically get into the vessel wall. I'll give you an analogy I always tell my patients. If you think about the vascular wall, the vessel wall, the inside of your artery as a tennis net, okay, right? And we are hitting tennis balls against the tennis net. And when you hit a tennis ball against the tennis net, what happens? The tennis ball just kind of drops. It can't go through the net. But if I take a bunch of golf balls and I hit golf balls at a tennis net, what happens? The golf balls go through the net. That analogy is very much similar to small, dense LDL particles as opposed to large, buoyant LDL molecules. So the LDL that's small gets through that vessel wall, gets entrapped in the artery, and tends to cause more heart disease. So understanding the difference, and when you get a standard lipid panel, right? When we get our standard lipid panels, we're getting your HDL, LDL, cholesterol, and triglycerides. Well, what we need to be getting, and if your audience hasn't had this, everybody needs to have what's called an advanced lipid panel, where you're looking at particle sizes, right? So we look at the particle sizes. And on top of that, we also need to be looking at vascular inflammation markers. And that's something else that we don't routinely get. But heart disease is an inflammatory-driven process. And there are vascular inflammation markers like CRP and LPPLA2. These are things that we need to be measuring because that gives us some insight that there is vessel inflammation going on. And we have to figure out the underlying reason why, because that's what's driving heart disease.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you directly, what is the one blood marker you think most doctors are currently ignoring that actually is the biggest predictor of heart attacks, cardiovascular disease?
Well, it's becoming more known now, but the one that we've ignored for the longest time is lipoprotein little a, LP little a. Okay, that is a cholesterol particle that has a very high risk of coronary vascular coronary disease, plaque buildup, and thrombus formation causing heart attacks. So heart attacks, if you have a 20% blockage, you can still have a heart attack because if that plaque ruptures, right? What ends up happening is, for example, when you cut yourself, what happens? You form a scab, right? Well, what inside the body, if we have an artery that's damaged, right, and we form a scab inside of the coronary artery, what happens? It blocks off that artery and you have a heart attack. Most people think you have to have a 90% blockage to have a heart attack. Most heart attacks occur on 30 to 40% blockage.
Come on, no way.
These are all things we need to talk about so people understand. I had a normal stress test, right? If somebody has a normal stress test is designed to pick up a 70% blockage or more. So guess what? You have a stress test, you have a 30% blockage, and 2 weeks later you have a heart attack. How did that happen? Because heart attacks don't necessarily have to have 80, 90% blockage. Like I said, if you have plaque, if you have a vulnerable plaque and the plaque ruptures, a clot forms in that artery, or a thrombus or a scab forms inside the coronary artery, and you have a heart attack. We have technology that allows us to look at that now too. So CT angiogram with AI platform that can look at inside of that artery and do plaque characterization. Times have changed and how we evaluate coronary artery disease.
I'm not getting back in a clinic anytime soon. Okay, so this makes me think, myself and a lot of people in my audience were very proactive and we were literally buying into this aspect of preventive medicine. And this kind of just makes me think we do a lot of things to take care of ourselves, and we can even get advanced panels now that are, air quote here, normal, within the normal range, but we're not trying to be normal. We're trying to maybe even get into that optimized range.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of hearing, if I go get this done and my doctor comes back and they're like, or the lab results come back and like, you only have a 20% blockage or only 20 to 30 this, that's not even good enough. It shouldn't be good enough. We should be getting that down. Is it possible to get to zero?
Well, once you have plaque, once you have a 20 to 30% blockage, we can make an argument. Can we reverse that 20 to 30% blockage? And That's a little bit of a tough. I can tell you that with some of the patients, some of the work that I do with some of the therapies, we have seen plaque regression. It's not the norm, but it can happen. But the key at that point is to make sure that we don't have plaque progression and to make sure that plaque is as stable as possible. There are different types of plaque. There's soft plaque, there's calcified plaque, and there's something called low density plaque. Low density plaque is that more thrombogenic, that more sticky plaque that causes the scab to form in the artery. We can actually evaluate that with, like I said, a CT angiogram with a AI platform called Clearly. That allows us to look at plaque characterization. Okay, anytime you see somebody who has low density plaque in the artery, that low density plaque is very high risk. So that's a person that you want to take very seriously. And what typically you will find is that low density plaque also correlates to the people who have the vascular inflammation markers that are high. And so those are people that, okay, we're going to be a little more aggressive with the medications. We're going to be more aggressive on some of the other nutraceuticals that we could recommend. And we're going to look at, well, what's causing the vascular damage in the first place that's causing me to have this inflammation? And then the typical things that we don't look for in traditional society, I would tell you that at least 50% of heart disease is driven by environmental toxins that we don't really do a great job of evaluating. Heavy metals, plastics, insecticides, and pesticides. I see a lot of
leading to cardiovascular disease.
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
How?
Absolutely. Because what did I say causes vascular inflammation and oxidative stress, causes damage to the vessels, right? So the smaller molecules come through, but what damages the vessel wall? The inner lining of our vessel is called the endothelium, right? And on top of that endothelium sits a layer called the glycocalyx. And the glycocalyx is a protective layer that's on top of the artery. But as the vessel is damaged from high blood pressure, from blood sugars being too high, from toxins like heavy metals, mercury, lead in the environment, they damage that layer of the glycocalyx. When the glycocalyx is damaged and the endothelium is damaged and we don't produce nitric oxide, the vessel becomes much more stiff, okay? It's not compliant, not stretchy, that doesn't vasodilate. And also, the nitric oxide is also important for preventing that stickiness of the vessel wall, right? So platelets, which form these clots, stick to the vessel wall, which then promotes more heart disease. Monocytes or white blood cells stick to the vessel wall, which causes more heart disease. So that inflammation and damage to the vessel wall from the metals, insecticides, pesticides, that's how heart disease is caused. And we do a pretty poor job. And we can measure these things now, and we can measure oxidative stress. One of the things that's really changed the whole field now is we can measure all these environmental toxins, and I can measure vascular inflammation, and I can measure oxidative stress and nitrosative stress markers. Nitrosative stress, I'm sure you're like, what the heck is that? We'll talk about that in a little bit.
So much new information here. I love it. So I got to ask, another misconception I think around cardiovascular disease is that, it runs in the family, I'm doomed. Or, I changed up my diet and it's gone. Or I'm very active. So is it genetics? Is it poor diet? Or is it lack of the right type and frequency of exercise that's driving heart attacks here?
This is a good one. There are some very strong genetic markers. We mentioned one already. Lipoprotein little a, LP little a, is a 90 to 95% genetically driven issue with the lipoprotein little a being high based on genes, right? You can't eat it up, you can't eat it down. There are drugs in the pipeline in phase 2 and 3 trials, I think right now, that are designed to lower LP little a, but right now, we don't have any great way to lower LP little a, and it is a real risk factor.
So if you have it in your genetics, you're just kind of
you're stuck with you're stuck with that high level. Now, does that mean because it's high you're going to have a heart attack? No, but the risk is higher. The risk of having further blockages develop or atherosclerosis, which means plaque building up, and thrombosis, meaning the clot forming, is much higher when you have LP little a levels that are high. And that's the LP little a, my grandfather had a heart attack at 45, his dad had a heart attack at 51, his brother had a heart attack. That's that type of family history that a lot of times will be LP little a. So that's by far the strongest genetic risk predictor, I think, of cardiovascular disease and having a heart attack. With respect to the other things, diet and exercise, I think that there's so many factors that kind of go into that. Certainly, from a dietary perspective, one of the things I think is incredibly important to talk about right now, there's no one-size-fits-all diet. There's no one diet that's the best for anybody, right? And we know that because of, I do genetic testing on every single patient that comes to the door, and there is something called nutrigenetics. how our body responds to specific nutrition. Some people can eat a lot of saturated fat, right, and have no issues with it. But another group who have specific gene variants, like, for example, a gene called ApoE, right? If you have an ApoE4 status, or if you have another gene as an ACE gene or TCF7L2, if you have those gene variants and you're eating lots of saturated fat, it's not going to end well, right? I had a patient who decided he was going to do carnivore diet because he read that it was good for heart disease and insulin sensitivity. And he darn near killed himself. We went from a cholesterol of 200 to 500 with all those vascular inflammation markers that just went through the roof. Okay. And it was all, we saw it all in the genetics, but he wanted to do it anyway. And I said, well, I don't know. And this was in 6 weeks this happened. Okay. So understanding the nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics is incredibly important, and making recommendations for your patients. I made this mistake I learned early on because I got on board with ketogenic diet probably 7 or 8 years ago, right? Probably longer than that now, probably close to 10 years ago. And I was telling everybody that, I thought that when you're looking at all the doctors, there were doctors that were talking about how it's reversing diabetes, which it does in most people. But if you have those genes that I'm talking about, the ketogenic diet is not necessarily the best thing for you because of the inflammation that's caused by the saturated fat and what happens to some of the numbers. Those cholesterol numbers can do just what I just told you.
So you're trading one health goal for another.
Right, okay. Yeah. And in fact, what I saw is that we would lower blood sugar numbers, right? But yet on the other end, we saw these vascular inflammation markers that were through the roof. The small dense LDL particles were through the roof, but it was largely genetically driven with that person. It didn't. 85% of the people that didn't happen.
But so it's like you're no longer diabetic, but you're really high risk for a heart attack.
Yeah, exactly.
Honestly, I'd take the diabetes in that case.
But this just goes to say why it's important, right? When you have the information, I say on my website, longevity science is 25 years ahead of medical practice, right? We have the data. We have the ability to look at these things. It's just not kind of standard practice, and it typically takes 20 to 25 years before we start to use all of the technology, all of the data that we have out there to really benefit our patients.
You kind of already touched on this, but I want to ask you directly: is plaque buildup reversible, or are we just slowing the inevitable?
I think that I have a number of patients that we've shown plaque reversal when we improve the overall vessel health, meaning we improve the glycocalyx function, we improve endothelial function, we actually get blood sugars down, we control the blood pressure, and then we use a product called phosphatidylcholine. Phosphatidylcholine is a phospholipid, which is the main phospholipid in our cell membranes. That phosphatidylcholine upregulates a process called reverse cholesterol transport. Okay, just like it sounds, reverse cholesterol transport takes the cholesterol out of our tissues, out of those arteries. Reverse cholesterol transport is what HDL does. So phosphatidylcholine upregulates HDL function.
Wow.
Okay. So we use a product I use phosphatidylcholine. The branded name on it is called Plaque, and by fixing the vessel wall, by improving the glycocalyx, and using phosphatidylcholine, getting the toxins out. Okay, I do, like I said, toxin testing on everybody. You can't fix the problem if there's still an ongoing onslaught of these toxins that are damaging the vessel wall. So first step is, how do we get the toxins out?
The environmental toxins matter that much.
Oh, absolutely. If you haven't, and I don't mean just heart disease. This is a much broader conversation. Everything that I talk about these days, all chronic diseases are driven by inflammation and oxidative stress. That inflammation and oxidative stress causes mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay, every single, whether it's diabetes, neurocognitive diseases, heart disease, autoimmune diseases, they're driven by inflammation. And I think of one disease, and every single one of them, they're driven by inflammation and oxidative stress. And what's driving all this inflammation and oxidative stress? All the toxins that we're exposed to. Okay, think about that. And why haven't we all had an environmental toxin test? Don't know. Okay, because you will be appalled once you start to see it. It's going to be a major shift. It has to be a major shift in our culture. Okay, when you start to do that test on everybody.
It matters a lot, and it's kind of sad. It takes us having a health scare or a major life change in order to take that more seriously. Mm-hmm. Personally speaking, mm-hmm. I did one at the house right before we had had our first child about a year or so ago, testing for a lot of things, environmental toxins, particularly mold.
Right.
And it came back pretty damn scary. Mm-hmm. And so what did I do next? I got the best home air purification system I could and put them in every room of the house. And it was more so for protection of my son. I had no idea it actually could be leading to something like cardiovascular disease for me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, just, again, go to PubMed and you just pull environmental toxins and heart disease. And look at things like lead and mercury, heavy metals particularly. but not just heavy metals. I mean, you even mentioned mold. Mold can cause heart disease. Never heard that, but guess what?
Because it's
Because
pro-inflammatory?
Yes, same thing. And again, pull that data. It's all there, but we don't really ever talk about the things that cause inflammation. But absolutely, anything that's causing inflammation and oxidative stress in the body can cause heart disease, and it's contributing to heart disease.
Okay. And again, I believe you already touched on this, but just kind of to the point, if someone wants to get an advanced diagnostic panel here, what are the inflammatory markers specifically they should request or look for to hopefully narrow down these environmental toxins and inflammatory markers?
Yeah. So just your basic, the panels you can get from the major labs like Quest and LabCorp will look at things like high sensitivity C-reactive protein, myeloperoxidase, lipoprotein phospholipase A2, LPPLA2, big old words, but one of probably the most specific for vascular inflammation would be LPPLA2, okay? Myeloperoxidase, ADMA, asymmetric dimethyl arginine, which actually interferes with nitric oxide production. We can talk about that in a little bit too, but that's another vascular inflammation marker. Homocysteine is a very important marker as well. Homocysteine is an inflammatory marker that causes a stickiness of the blood as well. Those would be the inflammation markers. Now, oxidative stress markers, there are a few out there, malondialdehyde, MDA, 8-OHDG, and then there's a company called Vibrant Wellness out here in California, actually. If you really want the most comprehensive oxidative and nitrosative stress panel out there, Vibrant Wellness has a new panel, new as of probably 8 months old, that really has changed the game. When I talk about inflammation and oxidative stress now, I don't have to just say this is what's causing it. We can measure it, and that is exactly what's causing it. Right.
Is there anything out of the norm you can think of that someone could work on to reduce an inflammatory response in their body? Out of the norm meaning diet, exercise, sleep.
Well, I mean, all of those things, diet, we always talk about, eating whole foods, eating organic food as much as we can, right? Avoiding toxic exposures, drinking purified water, cleaning your air, avoiding, for the longest time I was doing I think about the things that I did over the, 10 years ago, like microwaving and plastic. Those type things are just kind of right now, it's like no-brainers. And some people still don't understand that the implications of that.
The microplastic scene is terrifying right now.
Yes, absolutely. But so those are things that, I think that just from a general perspective, one thing that I always say, and my office always jokes with me about it, I could be a sauna salesman right now because I think the best tool, the number one tool from a longevity perspective for all chronic diseases and including heart disease would be using sauna.
Really?
Particularly I like infrared saunas, simply because if you look at the data on saunas and decreasing the risk of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular events, if you use a sauna 4 to 5 times a week, your risk of having a cardiovascular event is about 50% less.
Is that because it's detoxifying the body?
Well, detoxifying, but it actually stimulates nitric oxide release, right? It actually mobilizes your own stem cells, right? It improves mitochondrial biogenesis, so making new functional mitochondria. So there's a lot of benefits of the sauna. We can go on, upregulates heat shock protein. So it's a lot of things that the sauna does. But one of the major things is helping to get rid of the toxins that we're exposed to. We're going to all be exposed to toxins. We're not going to avoid it. I've come to the conclusion that we can be as clean and try to do everything right, but the world is the world today. And we're not going to avoid all the toxins we're exposed to. So making sure you're doing everything to optimize your own detox pathways, right? Making sure your gut health is intact. Making sure the micronutrients that are important for detox are optimized. Using the sauna, using other detox products, chlorella, charcoal, those type of things.
Activated charcoal I've seen is a pretty hot supplement to take before going into a sauna.
Yep. So I use a lot of activated charcoal with my patients as well with the saunas.
Amazing. Okay, so you brought it up. I want to get into nitric oxide.
Yeah.
This has been a hot topic for quite a few episodes before on the show. And I guess just out of the gate, how would you define and describe nitric oxide? And do you agree that it is, in fact, the most important molecule in the human body?
I would tell you that nitric oxide is incredibly important. And I would agree that it probably is the most important molecule in the body because of all the functions of nitric oxide. I think we have known and we think about nitric oxide as just a vasodilator. That's kind of what we think about it. But there's so much more to nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, again, like we talked about, it controls platelet functions. There's antiplatelet functions. The monocytes or white blood cells don't stick to the vascular wall. Nitric oxide helps with that. Nitric oxide controls the mitochondrial function. And nobody really talks about that. So nitric oxide has a lot of good roles, okay? But what I want to talk to you about today is when we talk about nitric oxide, we talk about the enzyme that makes nitric oxide is called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, eNOS, right? And that's incredibly important that eNOS is functioning normally to take this arginine and convert it to nitric oxide. But when I got involved with this company and learning about nitric oxide, the rabbit holes that I went down was to understand, that's eNOS. Well, there are other enzymes that make nitric oxide. There's nNOS, neuronal nitric oxide synthase, and there's iNOS, inducible nitric oxide synthase.
All these enzymes can equally create nitric oxide.
Well, not necessarily equally. iNOS makes nitric oxide at orders of magnitude higher, okay, than eNOS, much higher.
What makes this enzyme special?
Okay, well, here's the deal. It actually is used to fight infections. And so this nitric oxide is used when we have some bacterial infection, you had pneumonia, infections or inflammation drives the iNOS up. And so high levels of nitric oxide, okay, then cause, when nitric oxide levels are when they're high, the nitric oxide binds with a reactive oxygen molecule called superoxide. When we talk about getting rusty inside, there are a few ROSs, reactive oxygen species. Superoxide is one of the important ones. Well, when nitric oxide levels get super high, they combine with this superoxide and form a product called peroxynitrite. Okay, peroxynitrite is a very, very, very volatile molecule. It produces both oxidative and nitrative stress. So here's the thought. We've been taught about all the good things that nitric oxide does, but what about this iNOS and when iNOS is upregulated? And what did we just talk about? We talked about environmental toxins, the metals and all these things. Well, guess what those metals, what they all do? They drive up iNOS. They cause inflammation, which drive up iNOS. And then iNOS causes all this nitrosative and oxidative stress. How do we know that now? Back to that test that I just told you about. We can measure it. Okay. And guess what we see in patients right now that have heart disease? What I see is the peroxynitrite or something called nitrotyrosine levels are extremely high. That's a nitrosative stress.
Sorry, we can measure this enzyme and this other NO byproduct?
Yeah, we can measure when nitric oxide combines with the superoxide, we can measure those molecules, now peroxynitrite metabolites. Okay, so that's been talked about for a while, but it's never been brought to the forefront because we always just kind of talk about the good things with nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, when the levels are extremely high, has some effects on the mitochondria, has some effects on the vessel wall that are not always what we're looking for. So what we have to do is calm down this iNOS stimulation. We have to calm down the inflammation that's driven by all the toxins and things like that. And so that's why I said when I said we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this from a different perspective. And the other thing that peroxynitrite does, let me just say, this is super important. For eNOS to work normal, you probably heard of this concept called, I'm sure when Dr. Ignara was here and Nathan Bryan, Dr. Bryan was here, they talked about eNOS uncoupling.
Uncoupling, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Dr. Bryan touched on it, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about that for a second because this is a really pivotal concept to get, right? For that eNOS to work normally, right, to take arginine and convert it to nitric oxide, there are a lot of cofactors that are needed. There are things that are needed. Tetrahydrobiopterin or BH4 is needed to convert it. There's something called NADPH that's needed to convert it. We need oxygen to convert it. But when we don't have these cofactors, okay, what ends up happening is that arginine doesn't get converted to nitric oxide anymore because eNOS becomes uncoupled, falls apart, the enzyme falls apart. So now nitric oxide is being converted to superoxide, right? That's what uncoupling means. So what you can see is when we have all this inflammation that's driving peroxynitrite that's then coming back over and uncoupling my my eNOS. So now the nitric oxide that's normally being made in a way that we think it's helpful is not being made either. So it gets I think that we have missed a very important part of what causes chronic illness, and that's the nitrosative stress, peroxynitrite. We can measure it now.
Wow. So Did I hear you correctly that more nitric oxide is not necessarily a good thing?
When it's being produced at those orders of magnitude higher, no.
Is it because it doesn't have the right avenues to go down to be properly utilized?
Exactly, because the nitric oxide that when we have those high nitric oxide levels and we're producing more peroxide nitrite, that enos is becoming uncoupled. And so now we're not making nitric oxide normally. There's a concept called the arginine paradox, okay? Arginine, typically when people are working out there in the gym, they would take arginine to make nitric oxide for that pump, right? Well,
isn't that in a lot of pre-workouts?
But this arginine paradox, okay? Arginine paradox means you take arginine and I feel worse. Okay, how can that happen? Well, that's because if I take arginine and enos is uncoupled, then all of a sudden I'm producing more reactive oxygen species, more superoxide, and guess what? I feel worse. As we get older, enos becomes uncoupled just from getting older. So you need to be very careful in giving an older person arginine by itself, hoping that arginine is going to be converted to nitric oxide if the endothelial nitric oxide synthase, enos, is uncoupled.
Man, it's fascinating.
And the bigger part of this enos uncoupling a lot of times is this whole BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin deficiency. Tetrahydrobiopterin is very low. So and that's really important. So too much science. And I don't know, but this is really important because we have not paid enough attention. It's a totally
different approach, yeah.
We have not paid enough attention to nitrosative stress. Okay, so when this podcast is over, I want you to read and we can talk more. I want to give you some information because one of the goals over the last 2 years for me was really to bring an emphasis to this nitrosative stress because we've talked about oxidative stress forever, but nitrosative stress is as important, if not more important. And now we can measure it. And that's exactly what I'm seeing in the clinic. When we measure it now, the nitrotyrosine levels are through the roof in a lot of these people. Okay, so there now we can kind of start to, well, that's how we know that enos is likely uncoupled. What are we going to do? How do we even address these high levels of the nitrosative stress? Well, the first thing is what's making the enos high in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Right? Let's get to the source. Yeah.
Right. So that's actually getting out the toxins, getting out the infection. Right. That's getting rid of all the chronic Epstein-Barr virus and Lyme disease that are driving enos expression. And then there's some supplements and other things we can do that interfere with peroxide nitrite as well. But to get to the root of this and deal with all this inflammation and oxidative stress, nitrosative stress, we need to be thinking about it first. And that test coming along to measure it really has helped because now it's not theoretic anymore.
Right. Yeah.
It's there.
I'm curious, aside from getting the test, is there a qualitative state, a symptom that I might be able to put my finger on and go, oh, that's what's happening with me? Is there any kind of feeling associated to this?
I don't think we could, I don't think you could pinpoint it to the nitric oxide level being that part. It's just inflammation itself. You feel you're more inflamed, you're tired. But it's hard to say it's because of this enos being elevated and more nitrosative stress. You have to for us to really start to talk about this, is actually measuring is really, I read about it. This test came out and now I'm ordering and I'm like, whoa, okay, this concept is real, right? This peroxide nitrite thing is really real. Before I started doing this, when I give talks for A4M, I said, how many people have heard of peroxide nitrite? Not one hand goes up, right? When I say, have you heard about enos uncoupling? Even I'm a cardiologist, so I'm like, I heard it, but what does that mean? Okay. But now that I understand what it means and go down these rabbit holes, you start to see, wow, this whole nitric oxide physiology is very important. And when you ask the question, is it the most important molecule? I tell you it is, but it's understanding how it works at these different concentrations.
For different reasons.
Yeah, how it works together.
What about getting sequential snapshots? Is a one-off high reading of this going to be the telltale sign of, hey, you have some really wild NO things going on? Mm-hmm. Or is it like, hey, this is happening this time, you need to come back in a week, 30 days? Is it like a measurable thing over time that's really the red flag?
I think you have to look at the whole clinical scenario, what's been going on with the patient, and what's been going on with whoever that person is. If it's a long chronic symptoms that they've had, if they come in and it's just kind of a one-time thing, I think you have to just look at the entire scenario of that patient and understand, okay, there are some other things we can do to look at it. Other labs. You want to see if there are things that kind of would also be suggestive of it. For example, we mentioned about other inflammatory markers that we could check. There's one called ADMA, okay, asymmetric dimethyl arginine that I mentioned, Right. Well, if ADMA is high, that's a sign in itself that there's likely eNOS uncoupling. eNOS is going to be uncoupled because that ADMA is binding where the arginine would normally bind.
So that's kind of the smoking gun.
So that's a
bad NO
sign
situation.
you likely have some eNOS uncoupling if ADMA is super high. And so you're looking at the entire thing. Okay, ADMA is high, the LP-PLA2, the vascular inflammation marker is high, and then I see nitrotyrosine over here high, the peroxynitrite metabolite. Then they're likely related to each other, right? So I can't tell you that it is. If it's if I definitely in 4 or 6 months I come back and I'm looking at these numbers again, but I'm also what I'm seeing though is probably 80% of the time, 85% of the time, there's very few people who come through who don't have environmental toxins that are called. I mean, very few.
80 plus percent.
80 plus percent. That's why I check it every single patient.
Even in seemingly healthy adults.
Absolutely, 100%, 100%.
Jeez.
And I wasn't the environmental toxins. This is not what I intended to do with my career. This is not what I intended to talk about. But environmental toxins found me. And it's real. Once you see it a few times, and I'm wait a minute. So now, after thousands of these tests, I'm like, holy cow, right? We have totally missed the trees for the forest on many. But think about this though. We talk about it all the time, right? It's in the press. We talk about toxins all the time, right? But until you see it on paper, we were at an event in Florida. It was one of the Maha events. We were there, and I said, okay, if we really want to make a difference, let me ask you guys something. How many people in this audience have had an environmental toxin test? Again, right? And I would challenge them, if you get I challenge you, go get your environmental toxin test and then come back and let's talk about why we have so many chronic illnesses. It's not rocket science.
So that's kind of the hidden biomarker. I think a lot of us are getting more savvy to at least getting your physical and your traditional labs, but even getting into kind of the optimization range of checking extended biomarkers. This is the thing that I think is still on the horizon for most people.
I would tell you this, in the longevity space, I don't like the word biohacking, but in the biohacking space, we got all this stuff. All these light beds and cryo and molecular hydrogen, and we have all this stuff we can do, okay? If you're not looking at your environmental toxins and you're not minimizing your exposure and you're not getting those toxins out, then you're missing the forest for the trees again when it comes to longevity. Point blank. I don't mince words with it because I've seen it over and over. And when the oxidative nitrosative stress markers came out, just put the icing on the cake.
Yeah. So, all right, I take this environmental toxin test and things come back that need radical improvement. Mm-hmm. What are realistic things that I can do to make these changes, barring throwing everything in my house away, moving? What's realistic for most people?
So making sure your gut. We talk about gut health all the time for many, many different reasons. Well, for detox purposes, the gut health is the first place you start. You can't detox if the gut's not working normally. And the last thing you want to do is start some type of aggressive detox regimen when the gut's not working, right? So overall, improve the gut health, okay? But let me back up a couple of steps. First, you have to just start with the normal things that we talk about: diet, right? Exercise, sleep, right? Those are the three things that we always have to focus on, right? The body can never heal itself and won't repair itself if you're not getting enough sleep, right? Also, learning to deal with stress. Okay, we haven't talked about that at all, but another really, really important topic to talk about. We're talking about whether it's emotional stress, chemical stress, physical stress. All of those stressors fill up my stress bucket. And I always give this analogy of the stress bucket. When the stress bucket overflows, that's when we get sick, right? So dealing with the stressors in our lives and having some type of stress mitigation, whether it's meditation, breath work, that whatever works for you, is very important, and kind of minimizing the risk of inflammation, oxidative stress as well. So diet, what you're eating, what you're drinking, movement, exercise, sleep. Those are some of the basic things. Again, I wasn't joking about the sauna. I think that if you don't get the environmental toxin test, right? The environmental toxin test is not cheap. The one from Bioben is probably $700 or something like that. So it's not cheap. Okay, let's just say, assume that I have these toxins. That's why I now tell people, you know what? I would just try to use a sauna as much as we can. I mean, I use a sauna when I'm in town. I use a sauna 5-6 days a week for the last 2 years. The people who've come through my practice who don't have any toxins or any significant toxin buildup are people who've been using a sauna regularly for a year, 2. Wow. That is exactly what I see in the practice. The people who've been using the sauna, the people who don't have much in the way of toxins. Everybody else, they're there.
Man, I'm in it probably at least twice a week.
Yeah.
Ideally, 3 to 4 would be amazing, but that's good to know.
Yeah. Very important.
Yeah,
Very important.
And I think it's a great way for me personally. I like to use it as kind of a compounding space for my wellness practice,
Yes.
for a lot of things you just said of de-stressing. I'm usually in there, my phone's on the floor, kind of tracking the time with my Whoop, but I'm not distracted. It's, I'm meditating, I'm sitting, I'm stretching, I'm doing as little as possible. And that is wonderful for my stress on top of the benefits I'm getting from the heat.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the best way to use this on.
What happens if nitric oxide production just like craps the bed? It shuts down. What's the first thing that's going to happen?
I would probably say the first thing is kind of what we've all kind of been taught about. One of the main roles of nitric oxide and how it was found and why it won the Nobel Prize was the vasodilation. It's actually controlling blood pressure, and blood flow. So if the vessels are very stiff, blood pressure is much higher. So you're going to run into problems with blood pressure issues if nitric oxide just shut down. Right, the perfusion of the brain is going to be an issue because you're not able to perfuse the smaller vessels. The capillaries are not going to be well perfused if nitric oxide is non-existent. Okay, so I would say definitely some type of vascular compromise is going to be the first thing that happens if nitric oxide levels are low. Now, nitric oxide again has roles in the immune system and lots of other things, but I think the first thing we would probably notice is probably some of the vascular compromise.
In men, is erectile dysfunction always a sign of low to no NO production?
I won't say always because there are other things. I mean, there are nerve problems that can cause erectile dysfunction as well. But most of the time, I will have a saying, and that I tell my patients, ED is ED. And what does that mean? Endothelial dysfunction equals erectile dysfunction. We know that erectile dysfunction is one of the earliest markers of vascular disease because the erectile dysfunction is driven by endothelial dysfunction. How does a penis get an erection? It has to dilate the arteries for blood flow to come into the penis, right? If you have endothelial dysfunction, that vasodilation doesn't occur. So there's vascular damage. So again, the earliest sign of vascular damage is one of the early signs is actually erectile dysfunction. Most people don't think about that, but we absolutely should be thinking about that. If you have erectile dysfunction, you better get your heart and vasculature checked out.
So if I'm a guy and I'm having trouble down there, and I'm probably on the fast train to cardiovascular disease.
I would say
potential heart attack.
it's safe to say that you likely have some vascular disease and you need to get it checked out.
It's not just a problem in the bedroom, guys.
No, absolutely not.
So Dr. Brian brought up some interesting ways when he was on the show last that are potentially, or he was saying like without a doubt, are killing nitric oxide production and have some long-lasting negative effects on NO. Things like mouthwash, things like antacids. Are these NO killers?
Absolutely. I mean, there are other ways. So nitric oxide, we talked about the endothelial nitric oxide synthase pathway, the enzymatic pathway, where there are non-enzymatic pathways that turn nitrates, right? One of the reasons we use beet products and things like that is because the nitrates can be converted to nitric oxide. That has to happen, though, through the right bacteria in the mouth and converting the nitrate to nitric oxide. If you use mouthwash and you kind of kill off all of that microbiome that's normally in the mouth, then you don't have that normal conversion. So you don't use that non-enzymatic pathway efficiently to make nitric oxide from nitrates. Same thing, we need acid in the stomach for that to happen as well, right? And when we use antacids, we don't have that acid in the stomach, so you're not converting nitrite to nitric oxide.
So this isn't like a one-off thing. If I use mouthwash this morning and have heartburn,
no, I don't think. I don't think it's people who use it at longer term.
Okay,
so a one-time mouthwash, you're not gonna, have incredible, deficiencies of nitric oxide just because you use mouthwash one day. Okay, but if you're chronically using a mouthwash, then that could be a problem.
Dr. Ignaro, when he was on, and we got a lot of comments, a lot of flack, I'll say, about this, and his personal approach about the carnivore diet and how basically saying carnivore diet is a deadly diet. Would you agree? Particularly through the lens of NO here.
Well, I don't know that I would say it's a deadly diet. I think I don't think any extreme diet like that is a diet that it's a long-term diet. I spoke a little bit earlier about using nutrigenomics to make decisions. I have seen people who are diabetic, who use a carnivore diet, who have reversed their diabetes doing that too. I don't think that's a longer term solution. I do think that we do have to be careful. Protein is very important, and the amount of protein that we get is very important. But we can have some protein overstores and have a lot of stress on the kidneys trying to get rid of a lot of the breakdown products and metabolites of the protein as well. So I wouldn't say that it's a killer, but I don't think it's something that's a long term. Any of my patients, if you're going to do that, I don't think it's a long term solution to anything.
Even people like Dr. Sean Baker, I've had him on the show a long time ago, and I think by now he's probably running 10, 12 plus years on carnivore diet. And this dude is a global powerlifting strongman, record breaker, orthopedic surgeon, just, big guy. And he shares all of his labs and stuff. Now, is that just because of his genetics?
Well, I think that absolutely is always an individualized thing. It is. I mean, what I would tell you, I would never, ever make a decision to do that without knowing my nutrigenomics, ever. I mean, I could show cases. In fact, I do this. I did a talk last A4M meeting that I showed a case just like, what we're talking about. And this guy, Dagon Neil, killed himself in about 2 months going on a carnivore diet without knowing the genetics. So, and so there's so much information. Our genes are not our destiny, but it certainly gives us propensities. And there's something called high impact genes. There are certain genes that if you have that gene variant, you should not be on a carnivore diet. Now, if his labs are all great, then I can tell you that he doesn't have those genes, but we don't know until you can kind of look at those genes. Now, you can try that strategy, and then if you're serially following your labs and everything looks okay, right? And you have to make sure you're getting all the right labs too, right? Then I think you can make the argument. Then okay, well, looks I've 3 months from now I looked my cholesterol numbers, my LDL and small dense particles and inflammation markers. Again, the thing I would be looking at is I'm really not even concerned about the cholesterol. I'm looking at vascular inflammation markers. Okay, I'm looking at oxidative stress markers. Those are the things that cause heart disease. Those are the things that cause vascular disease. Those would be the things I'd be looking for to figure out, okay, is this a diet that is safe for me or not?
What about a poor night's sleep? Or I should say, what does chronic poor sleep do for nitric oxide production?
I think that one of the things we can say about poor night's sleep is going to, as you think through some of the processes, cortisol levels tend to go up, right? And so cortisol has a lot to do with a lot of things that kind of go on in the body, but certainly cortisol levels being high causes more inflammation, which then will come back around, cause more issues with iNOS upregulation, eNOS uncoupling. Thus, nitric oxide goes down simply from cortisol levels going up. And when cortisol levels go up, what else happens with that? Blood sugars go up, right? So cortisol levels drive blood sugars, which then cause more vascular damage as well. So all these things is kind of a complex kind of feedback mechanism.
Like
on
one hand
nitric
feeds
oxide.
the other here.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think is one maybe silent killer most people are doing in their day-to-day life that they don't realize is detrimental to nitric oxide production? I think a lot of people are probably shelving their mouthwash and taking it easy on acids at this point. That's a pretty big surprise.
Really, I think the thing that I would think about, I'm trying to think about, well, what are people doing that's causing systemic inflammation the most? Because that systemic inflammation is what ends up uncoupling nitric oxide to cause nitric oxide levels to be low. So anything, I think probably the most common thing that we do, again, the diet and eating, diets that are high in things like the metals and pesticides. So back to what I talked about, I think that if we're not eating a clean diet, organic food, which we could go down this road about, I have a couple of patients that are farmers that do organic stuff, and I'm kind of, they've told me, well, Doc, this is a true story. Doc, it's all a game. I don't really want to hear that in my mind right now.
Yeah,
but
the organic game got some flack I think last year, 2025. It's it wasn't really quite what we thought it was.
No, and that's a problem, because what do you, as the physician, it's very hard for me to, I could, when you tell your patients that, and they know, and I know too, that it may not be all they cracked up to be, right? But I can't tell them otherwise. I can't say, well, don't worry about it. Just go eat whatever. Just eat whatever. It doesn't have to be organic. But we need a better way to kind of to to prove that these foods are truly organic and truly don't have all the same pesticides and herbicides. That's a major problem. And I don't, even as a clinician, I really have a hard time figuring out how do we address that issue. Same thing with water testing. Like, how do we prove? Maybe patients will often ask me, okay, I've got this water filtration system and I have this system versus that system. It's very hard to know.
We all just want to know what's the best, right? What's the best food to eat for this?
Yeah.
What's the best water? What's the best test? What's the best supplement? What's the best this for that? But I'm kind of hearing that there are a lot of great options, but it really doesn't matter as much as we think it does without knowing these key biomarkers, genetic predisposition.
Yeah.
So that's really the best place to start.
Yeah, I think the biomarkers, the right testing, we always say test, don't guess, but the right tests are very important. And again, it's the advanced lipid testing is super important. But for me right now, that oxidative stress test has really changed the game, because that's what makes it. When we get rusty, right? That's what getting old is about. When we talk about longevity, right? You're getting older because you're getting rusty inside. I can't explain it any clearer than that. And if you see that the oxidative stress markers are high, then we know, okay, what can I do? And why is this? Okay. And what can I do to mitigate these elevations in the oxidative and nitroxidative stress markers?
You mentioned beets earlier. When I think nitric oxide, especially in dietary parameters, I always go to beets. Is it true? Are beets the magical NO producer here? What's so magical about them?
So the same thing we just did. So beets have the nitrates, high nitrate levels. Green leafy vegetables, right? Arugula, other green leafy vegetables have high nitrates. The beets are doing you no good if you are using mouthwash and eating the beets, right? But
and then it causes heartburn, right? So you're taking an acid.
Indeed, taking an acid, right? Assuming that your microbiome is intact in your oral mucosa, that the beets, the nitrates are converted to nitric oxide. But again, green leafy vegetables. When we talk about, for years and years, we talk about eating green leafy vegetables and the benefits, but we never talked about it. It was just the green vegetables and all the flavonoids and polyphenols and things in it. But guess what? Those green leafy vegetables also increased nitric oxide production. So it wasn't about eating your greens just for those things. Eating the greens had a lot to do with the nitric oxide production.
And especially for men, a lot of these same leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables are great for testosterone boost.
Yep.
What about, when I think beets and I think NO, I think vasodilation. Are other things that increase vasodilation in the body good for NO production? I go to cordyceps, this functional mushroom. It's a natural vasodilator. Are you familiar with it?
Yep.
Can we get the same results, or is it we're just getting the vasodilation benefits, not necessarily the NO boosting benefits?
Are there other...
Or what are other things that increase vasodilation that we can also see support NO?
So I don't know whether, other things that support vasodilation are things like grapeseed extract and aged garlic, but I don't know. Those don't, they have some effects on the enos coupling and inflammation. I'm kind of thinking through, which can help with nitric oxide production. So again, in a roundabout way, I could see some of the other things that like aged garlic and grapeseed extract. Other things that increase, the things that are going to improve the coupling of the enos, right? For example, vitamin C is very important in the recycling of tetrahydrobiopterin, BH4. We talked about that BH4 being a major part of how the enos converts arginine to nitric oxide. So BH4, there's a BH4 supplement. There's a natural product that has some BH4 in it, and it's called royal jelly.
Yeah. I've heard that, yeah.
So royal jelly is actually from worker bees. So really extracted from worker bees. They actually feed the queen bee. This is something that I learned not too long ago, understanding what royal jelly was. But so it actually, the worker bees actually produce a milky-like substance that has higher concentrations of BH4 in it. And it's interesting, the queen bee lives about 20 to 40 times longer. And all the queen bee feeds on is this compound that's high in the royal jelly, or that has a lot of BH4 in it. So it's kind of interesting. But that's
propolis?
I don't know if that, I think propolis is different than the actual BH4 that's in there. It might be. The supplement I'm talking about, it's called BH4 Assist, and they don't mention that this is actually propolis. I think propolis is different, but I'm not sure on that. I have to check that, to be honest with you. I'm not sure. But having BH4 that's going to keep the enos coupled would be important in producing more nitric oxide as well. Other things that are going to help with that. Those are the main things. I will say one other thing. We'll go ahead and just kind of hit this real quickly too. Folate, methylfolate is important too, because the same thing. Recycling tetrahydrobopterin and dihydrobopterin. It takes the folate to actually go to take from BH2 back to BH4 to tetrahydrobopterin. So folate is very important. So people who don't methylate well may have problems with the nitric oxide production as well because of uncoupling, because they don't convert BH2 back to BH4.
How do I know if I don't methylate well?
Oh man, that's easiest thing is homocysteine levels are typically high. Okay, so measuring homocysteine. Homocysteine is another marker that everybody should have from a cardiovascular perspective. Homocysteine, again, is an inflammatory marker that makes the blood very sticky. So higher risk of stroke, higher risk of heart attack, higher risk of things like clots in the legs, DVT, deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary emboli. When you don't methylate well, whether it's from methylation gene variants, MTHFR, MTRR, or what you're B vitamin deficient, right? Methylation is a B vitamin, needs B vitamins as cofactors, particularly B2, B6, B9, and B12.
Okay? I have that deficiency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and homocysteine tends to trickle up, right, when you have all these B vitamin deficiencies. So the beautiful thing about it is that it's a big risk when homocysteine is high, but it's also very easy to bring homocysteine down when you just kind of normalize the B vitamins. So just giving a product that's higher in those B2, B6, B9, B12 can help bring down the homocysteine level significantly. And that's something I think that's incredibly missed and overlooked. And homocysteine is a very kind of pro-inflammatory molecule. If you have a homocysteine of 20, your risk of having some type of blood clotting, heart attack, stroke event is much higher than if the homocysteine is 10 or less. Okay, so that's another lab that everybody needs to know what the homocysteine level is, but it's a good marker of whether you're methylating or not methylating.
What about nasal breathing?
That can increase. Yes, that can increase. Yeah, so I don't do enough of that, but I actually can increase nitric oxide production as well.
How does that work? Why is that a thing?
I don't know the exact mechanism of why. There's something I've kind of read about that. I've heard Dr. Nathan talk about. I've heard about people talking about, but the exact mechanism of nitric oxide release from nasal breathing, I don't know the exact mechanism.
I think if memory serves him talking about it, and I think Dr. Ignaro, was something about like the submucosal layer is like the first actual place that NO gets activated. I think through one of these enzymes. Okay. So it all starts through the nose. And if we're mouth breathing or poorly nasal breathing, we're losing out on that opportunity basically
to really stimulate more nitric oxide.
And then also kind of getting into humming as well. But I think that's more because it triggers the vagus nerve.
Yeah, I've heard the humming thing too. Yes.
So are you on board with the humming thing for
I've not. I don't talk about it a lot, but I've certainly heard it. And mechanistically, stimulating the vagus nerve, and that probably has to do with inflammation as well, because stimulation of the vagus nerve downregulates inflammatory cascades. So I can imagine that's why you can have more nitric oxide production.
If I had to totally guess, it's just because of that. We're going parasympathetic, sympathetic. We're just triggering that response consciously, voluntarily, just by triggering the vagal nerve. So then it's just you're de-stressing, you're becoming less inflammatory. So I think that's just from my holistic understanding.
Yeah.
But
we know the vagus nerve is very important in immune system regulation and inflammation. And so when the vagus nerve is not working normally, the inflammatory cascade is upregulated. So I think by just engaging that parasympathetic tone from humming, we're going to kind of bring down some of these inflammation markers. Yeah.
And then what about these other zones in exercise? I hear maybe, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone. They're all good for different things. Yep. Is there a particular zone one could be training in that is going to be better for nitric oxide production?
Good question. Let me think about that one physiologically. I have not thought about it from that perspective, but I do a lot of VO2 max testing and
more specifically, I've heard zone 2 kind of being more recommended for NO production. What's so unique about zone 2 that you would think?
Well, zone 2 is where zone 2 basically is the fat burning zone. I recommend zone 2 a lot, primarily because it actually is the best way to burn fat for you. Basically, getting the heart rate up into, I mean, it's kind of like a slow walk. I mean, kind of a fast-paced walk for most people, but why that would produce more nitric oxide than other zones, a higher heart rate. So let me just kind of think through. Basically, at a higher zone, you're going to have higher heart rates, shear stress. One of the things that actually, if I had to think through this physiologically, it would not seem to me that zone 2 would produce more nitric oxide. It would seem to me physiologically because nitric oxide is produced by shear stress. Shear stress is actually blood flow. When the blood is moving faster, the glycocalyx is actually sensing the blood flow, and shear stress stimulates nitric oxide production. So why
Well, if that's
zone
the case,
2
strength training would be better then, no? Because aren't you more
Well, no, strength training.
more strictly
That's
constricting and
vasoconstriction,
relaxing,
right? Yeah, that's not. I don't. We should look into that. I mean, I would, if you had asked me that and I had to backtrack like I did to figure out when I would expect more nitric oxide, I would have said at higher heart rate. So the zone 4 would be more than zone 2. So we'd have to we'd look at that. I don't know. And that's just physiologically, right?
Yeah.
Because shear stress is what induces nitric oxide release. You got more shear stress when you are doing more of a zone 4 hit type of thing than you do when you are doing the zone 2.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know. We have to we'd have to look at that again. When I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know. But when I had to think, when I think through, I would have said that it's the higher heart rates because of more shear stress.
Okay. So would you say, I kind of already touched on this, strength training versus cardio. Do you have a preference there, particularly thinking through the lens of NO?
Well, I think that I have a preference with respect to the exercise regimen. When I think about overall health and wellness, I have changed my entire recommendations on everything over the past 3 years.
How so?
Before I was a very HIIT-oriented, CrossFit-oriented individual, but I think as we get older, when we think about metabolism and in optimizing overall metabolic function, that zone 2 training to burn fat has really become, like for me right now, when I'm reviewing my patient's charts, every single morning I'll take an hour and I walk 4.5 miles for an hour, and I still lift weights, but I don't.
You're walking and reviewing charts?
I have my iPad on the treadmill, and that's I got to do it anyway. So what do? I do 4.5 miles. 4 miles every single day during the week, because that's when I'm reviewing those charts. But I would say not enough people do enough zone 2 training to improve overall fat burning ability. But still doing some. So I have other devices. I have like a Vasper in my office. I don't know if
What's that?
So Vasper is a combination of high intensity interval training, but short sprints, cooling and compression, right? So compression therapy. So doing compression therapy to increase lactic acid you've seen people who use, you ever heard of compression therapy bands?
Like blood flow restriction bands kind of thing?
Yeah, blood flow restriction bands, right. So basically it's a device where you actually do high intensity interval training with blood flow restriction and cooling. And it actually optimizes, it does a lot of things, to be honest with you, but one of the big things that it does is it helps to improve VO2 max. It increases hormones naturally, both growth hormone and testosterone. Lots of university studies done with this Vasper. You've seen it, I'm sure. I have a longevity center where we have all these gadgets and tools and stuff like that. But that's where I've seen the people who do the Vasper and something called the Carol bike are the ones that are making the biggest differences, the biggest jumps in their VO2 max, the biggest body composition changes, the biggest changes in just overall. One of the things we look at on our body composition is something called phase angle, which is a measure of cell membrane health, cell membrane efficiency. Phase angles get better when people are using these particular devices. So,
Never heard of this.
Yes, phase angle.
That's all new to me.
Oh man. So one of the things, and this is really important too, when we look at the in-body, you've heard of an in-body, people go get an in-body and we just know body composition. There's so much more data on that thing, right? There's so much more data on an in-body. I'm sure visceral fat, right? Super
Skeletal
important,
mass,
right?
free fat mass,
Right.
total weight.
And the phase angle is on there too. That phase angle is something that's really not looked at, and it is probably one of the, short of it's a good look at overall cell membrane health. right? It's measuring. So essentially, our cell membranes act as capacitors, and how much charge and what you're doing when you do a bioimpedance, you stepping on the device, right? And it's sending a little electric charge through you, and it's measuring the capacitance of your cell membranes, and that gives us an idea of cell membrane function. And so people who are super duper sick have that low phase angles. As they start to get better, as we start to get the toxins out, as we start to give them phospholipids, and we see the phase angles get better as they get better. So the cell membrane function, the mitochondrial membrane function is getting better, and you can use the surrogate marker is the phase angle.
Man, I got to check into that. I used InBodies in clinic forever ago, and maybe we had the lower level version. But I feel like I didn't know about that at all, and maybe it's relative.
So anything above the 580 and the 770 InBodies.
Okay, those are the big boys.
Those are the big boys.
All right, awesome. So your world is cardiology. Are you? We haven't actually said it. Let's introduce professionally your day to day. What are you doing?
So I do probably about 50% of my business is cardiology. I have a concierge, so I don't really like that word, but I have a cash-based practice where I do functional medicine, cardiology, and I have a longevity center. So I have a center that has hyperbaric chamber, cryo chamber, light bed, molecular hydrogen. We have a full fitness facility,
all the goodies.
ARX, All Core, Vasper, Carol Bikes. And then I have my office that's upstairs in that same building. We have IV therapy, plasmapheresis, EBOO, regular ozone. It's pretty much all encompassing, a little bit of everything. I have two other doctors that do more chronic illness, Lyme, cancer stuff. I have another doctor who does a lot of hormones and peptides. I got 50% of my business is about the cardiac stuff and a different approach to cardiology. With all the technology we have, I'm really looking now at starting a different type of cardiac rehab. Not the cardiac rehab that you get after you have a heart attack at the hospital. I mean, with the technology that we have today and all of the other capabilities that we have, man, we could take cardiac rehab could be cardiac rehab on steroids. But
I want to ask you specifically, if you could wave a magic wand over the world of cardiology right now, what would you do and why?
Well, it's about understanding what truly causes vascular disease. I think we started out at the very beginning of this interview, and this is super important. We've been so accustomed to just chasing the if there's anything that there's nothing in this world that drives me more crazy than chasing a cholesterol number. Nothing. Okay, because the number of patients who come in my office and they're chasing a cholesterol number and not looking at the vascular inflammation and not looking at what's causing this cholesterol to change into these oxidized and forms and lipid peroxides that are truly causing heart disease. It just burns me because we're missing the forest for the trees. We're not looking at where the true problem is being caused. We're trying to put you on a medicine to get to a number. Okay, and it just makes no sense to me, right? And so so if I had to wave my hands, I wish that, particularly a cardiologist would wake up and understand that it's just not about thinking that you're doing your job and helping that patient by getting a cholesterol to a number. It's just backwards to me. Backwards. I can't say what I really want to say, but backwards.
I can see the wheels are turning.
I had to hold back. And I can show cases out. I mean, let me tell you, I have probably the most dramatic case of that. I have a guy who had a cholesterol of 150, a total cholesterol of 115, and his LDL was, 46 or something like that, right? So his numbers are incredibly low. But over 1 year, probably I think 14 months, he had the coronary disease that he had based on clearly imaging, which is the AI imaging, CTA. The amount of plaque progression he had in 1 year was incredible, okay? So this is a person who had a cholesterol of 115. Well, my cholesterol is 115. Why am I having a progression that looks like I'm just kind of growing plaque every other day, right? Well, what ended up happening is that he moved out of the neighborhood he lived in into another neighborhood. And what I did, I earthed his house, and he moved onto the golf course. So he had a toxin test from a year and a half ago, and then we got another toxin test with the oxidative stress markers. And everything that I'm telling you, okay, the toxins with all these pesticides, DDT, DDA, all the DDT metabolites were through the roof, okay? And his oxidative and nitroxidative stress markers were through the roof. And you wonder why the coronary disease progressed.
Talk about bringing it back full circle to your analogy of the golf balls going through the tennis net. this guy's literally he moved
On the
into
go.
the belly of the beast.
And when you see the person, when I did this presentation, I literally took the snapshot of his house with the golf course, with the, his backyard is 2 holes. And I showed his toxin test a year and a half prior and the toxin test now. And I showed his coronaries and a cholesterol of 115.
Oh man.
So we're chasing cholesterol.
I hope he's getting that country club membership discount. That's I don't know if he signed a waiver moving in on that one.
I know there are a lot of golfers, and so it's I don't want to, I'm just preaching reality, man. I'm just preaching reality.
So I mean, my mind immediately goes, I'm not really a golfer. I play every once in a while, but is there anything I can do before stepping out into the green to protect myself?
Well,
do I need to decontaminate?
Well, when you come home,
or?
one of the things, man, if you got your golf shoes on, don't come home and walk around the house with your golf shoes on, right? Number one. But also when you come home, take a shower. And then obviously if you're golfing, make sure you're optimizing your detox pathways. The same thing that I said. If I'm a golfer, I'm using a sauna. I have a sauna in my somewhere very close by, right?
Yeah. All these golf clubs,
right?
Add a sauna, add a sauna.
Yeah, I don't want to start any trouble, but I'm just telling you, if you're a golfer, you need to get an environmental toxin test. I promise you.
Before I get to my last question, this has been so eye-opening. Again, I'm just so blown away into the world of nitric oxide, particularly, which is why I love revisiting it. And you've definitely shined a light on several new areas for me and my audience. Thank you. Also, just amazing energy. Appreciate you bringing the energy to the show today.
Absolutely.
Before the final question, if someone, you've shared so much already today, but if you had to boil it down to one thing they could do this week so that they don't become the statistic of cardiovascular disease being the #1 killer in America, what can they do?
First, really the first thing is getting the right testing. If you've gone to your doctor and you've had just your checkup and they've checked your cholesterol, get the advanced lipid testing with those inflammation markers. That tells you a lot. If those inflammation markers are elevated, we need to take the next steps and we need to kind of figure out the testing that we have available to us today, again, with the CT angiogram, with the overlay to look that we can literally, I have a patient come in, we do a CT scan and I can look up and down your arteries non-invasively, right? I don't have to do a heart cath anymore to go in and see those arteries. We can look up and down that artery and we can characterize what type of plaque is in your artery, right? You want to know if you have that low density sticky plaque. That's why people drop dead with a 30% blockage. That's why the 45-year-old has a heart attack and he was healthy. Okay. We have the ability to detect that early. The laboratories and the imaging modalities that we have, there's no excuse for us not to do a better job of that right now.
I'll never forget this not spoiler alert, heads up, red flag here, kind of something graphic. One time I was running a formation, I was in the military and running a formation on base just as we do every day. And this guy in front of me just dropped dead.
Whoa.
He was like 30 years old, maybe, had just had a kid, in great shape. We ran 3 to 5 miles every day and right in front of me just dropped dead.
Wow.
And it was because of exactly what you're talking about.
Wow.
Seemingly healthy, all this stuff. This was 15, 18 years ago, if not longer. So, who knows? This kind of lab probably wasn't available. The Army sure as hell wasn't giving it out at the time.
Right.
It just goes to show you, this is the stuff we're talking about. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of prevention, they say.
Yep.
Or no, I butcher this phrase, but just a little bit of knowledge goes a long way.
Yeah, and it is. And we have, we definitely have the technology today from a prevention perspective. When we talk about heart disease, I think heart disease being the #1 killer, we have the tools and technology to make that not the case.
And so all of this is meant to help me and my audience learn something new in a unique area of our well-being, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and then collectively to help us move forward and live a life ever forward.
Absolutely.
Those 2 words, Dr. Davis, what do they mean to you? How do you live a life ever forward?
Ever forward. For me, it's a great question, and I love that. I love those terms. For me, it's all about making moves moving forever. I'm forever moving forward to improve myself. And what I do with my clients, I'm trying to do the same thing for them, right? It's really just about educating them so that they are forever moving forward with being the best version of themselves. And from a family perspective, a business perspective, it really is about, we're all here for each other, right? It's about loving each other. It's about caring about each other. And we just want to be the best version of ourselves. So that's what it really is about for me. I'm forever, I love to learn. One of the things I learned about when I made this whole transition to what I do now, I'm in a place right now that I love what I do because I just continue to learn. Like I don't know all the stuff, but the more I learn, the more I'm able to educate. I'm forever moving forward with the education, and I'm trying to expand that and let everybody else know it too. But that's how we change lives, right? I can change more lives on platforms like this than seeing patient after patient after patient. There's a limit there, right? The more exposure, the more we get out and we kind of talk about things like this, and people, however many people, 100,000s that you're listening to, they're listening to this podcast, then they're listening to this, and then I've affected many more people than I would affect on a day-to-day basis, just sitting behind the desk all day. Don't get me wrong, I love taking care of patients, but this is how we get the message out.
I agree. And honestly, that was a huge driving force behind my decision to leave clinic. I was a clinical health coach for like 4 years, and I loved what I did. I loved seeing patients every day, getting them on the in-body, getting them on the treadmill, lifestyle behavior modification, getting them off medication, looking at their labs, working with their doctor. I loved it. It was so rewarding. But then, started the show, and I realized that if what I really love is helping people, and I want to help as many people as possible, while me being able to continuously educate myself and move forward in life, there's a different way to do it. And now here we are 8 years later. I can't believe.
Congratulations, man. That's super exciting. And you are making a bigger difference that way too. So I applaud you. I applaud you, man.
Thank you. Well, this was so fun. Seriously. Honestly, a dream of mine, I think, with these hard-hitting topics that just land so well with my audience, I would love to get you, Lou, and Nathan on the show and just kind of like, an NO battle royale.
Absolutely.
So many unique perspectives. And also, I think, just a world of varying interests. Personally and professionally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe one day, we'll see.